all the law allows at the moment is for a parent to, if they wish, to use a very mild smack on the bottom or a tap on the back of a hand or leg. There is no evidence that this very moderate and very limited defence has been misused to allow parents to get away with abusing their children. And the idea that it leads to escalation, that a parent who uses a very mild smack today will beat their child black and blue tomorrow, is just such an insult to millions of normal, decent parents who would never dream of doing any such thing. You might as well say that shouting at your child should be banned, because that too can sometimes escalate. It is really a ridiculous and offensive notion. We know that there are no popular calls for a ban. It may be an issue which obsesses certain activists and certain people, but the idea that the public are clamouring for us to criminalise parents who smack is far from the truth. And polling in Scotland and Wales ahead of the smacking bans there demonstrate how unwanted and unwelcome these new regimes are. 76% of Welsh adults said no to changing the law in 2017, and 74% of Scottish adults opposed a smacking ban. And I haven't seen much discussion of it in Northern Ireland. Now, journalists and campaigners and some of the noble ladies and lords have already said they're prone to claiming that this study says this, or that research says that, or that psychologist says this, and that it deserves to be criminalised. But if you actually look at the data, and you usually find either that the researchers are just sort of active campaigners dressed up as they're dressing up their views as science, or that the research did not make the claims that were attributed to it. And I'm not aware of any reliable studies showing actual causation between gentle physical chastisement of the kind we're talking about today and negative child outcomes. By removing the reasonable chastisement protection, tapping your child on the hand or the bottom would become a crime. Would become a crime. An assault, as some of the noble ladies call it. If this, if this happened, of course, then the police and others and everyone would have a duty to report and investigate every case that came to their attention. Every instance of a loving mum or dad using a little smack in a reasonable and normal manner, perhaps when the child was in imminent danger, would suddenly be liable for prosecution. That cannot be anything but detrimental to that family's trust in the authorities. Removing this safeguard would likely result in significant over-reporting social services. The twitching curtain brigade would love it. There are probably thousands and thousands of parents using reasonable chastisement every day, and the idea that they would all stop overnight because we tell them to, I'm afraid, is pretty naive. Even if only a fraction of those parents came to the attention of the authorities, it would place considerable pressure on the already overburdened social services and police. And this would dilute the resources available to help truly vulnerable children and their families. Some of them would eventually slip through the cracks and be overlooked. And I do believe, my lords, that this would be the legacy of passing this amendment. In all honesty, I fail to see how removing the reasonable chastisement helps families at all. It would increase the pressure on reasonable parents and dissolve their trust. It would increase the pressure on our vital services and those most at risk. Families are the backbone of our society, and they deserve all the support we can give them. The reasonable chastisement defence is, by definition, a reasonable law.
My Lords, this amendment attempts to repeal the defence of reasonable punishment as part of the Children's Act, and that would effectively, in my mind, criminalise parents for reasonably chastising their own children. In doing so, the amendment raises a number of ethical pitfalls that I think the state faces whenever it legislates in policing private family life in a free society. Historically, we've recognised that state interventions into family life should be rare, proportionate, and handled with due respect for parental autonomy. In recent years, sadly, we've seen an unfortunate trend towards top-down overreach, and this amendment is a good illustration. In the whole of the domestic abuse bill, with its focus on helping those abused in domestic settings or context, we still need to remember that this is not a green light to tear up all the norms of privacy and liberty when it comes to family life. Essentially, this amendment would remove the legal defence of reasonable chastisement from parents who might occasionally smack their own children. Effectively, this declares that the government knows better than loving parents who could find themselves vulnerable to charges of common assault just for being parents. Also, this amendment is entirely unnecessary because it's already illegal to aim a smack at a child's head or hit a child with an object, or any smack that leads to more than the temporary reddening of skin. In other words, unreasonable punishment is already against the law, and rightly so too. The vast majority of society view violence aimed at children as abhorrent. They think that beating children shouldn't just be illegal, but morally condemned, as we all do. So what would this amendment outlawing even a reasonable use of smacking achieve? The amendment states that, and I quote, "Battery of a child cannot be justified on the grounds that it constitutes reasonable punishment." And of course, battery can't be justified on the basis of reasonable punishment. But think about that use of that word battery. It conjures up horrors, doesn't it? And why was that word used in this amendment? I noticed in campaigns to ban smacking in Wales and Scotland that one of the most egregious tactics of anti-smacking lobbyists was this irresponsible conflation of smacking with gross acts of violence. This rhetorical trick is shameless and shamefully distorts intention and context. I think it's important to state for the record that violence is physical force intended to injure. In contrast, if a mum or dad smacks a 5-year-old child for being naughty, they have no intention of causing injury. Rather, they, all of us, want to teach our own children right from wrong, to chastise them for running in front of a car or whatever. And this is driven by parental love, not a desire to injure. Conflating slapping with violence paints ordinary mums and dads as potential violent thugs or child abusers. It's just so insulting, and it shows a certain distrust of ordinary parents that we heard tonight people describing smacking and beating the living daylights of children in the same sentence. To the noble Baroness Bennett, who argued that we should treat the smacking of a child as we treat the bodily attack on a grown adult, again, let's think about context. Do we really believe that children should not be treated differently to adults? In the real world, parents do many things to their children that they wouldn't dream of doing to another adult. When you order a child to bed, you don't order adults to bed, do you? When you check whether your child's bottom is clean, you wouldn't do that to an adult. Children, we do treat differently to adults, especially our own children. If you confiscate your teen's Xbox or phone, we don't consider that theft because of the context. It's common sense disciplinary action, as smacking can be, and smacking is not assault or even comparable. So, my lords, I hope you agree with me that parents are better placed to judge when and how to discipline their offspring than any number of NGOs, even if they come waving state-approved parenting manuals full of best practice checklists and count to 10. Finally, the danger with overreach is when it expands who and what is that it expands who and what is criminalised. And as I've warned several times during this bill, and as the noble Baroness Hoey pointed out, this could open the floodgates to complaints of minor incidents to police and social services and overwhelm already overstretched services. When I argued this in Wales in relation to the debate there, I was assured that the legislation was not about criminalising parents, but sending a message. But politicians can't change the criminal law and expect the police and courts not to enforce it. It's not a communication strategy. But also, the Scottish Government encouraged the public to phone 999 if they witnessed any parents smacking their child, and have also distributed leaflets aimed at children, urging them to report on their parents. Can you imagine how divisive that is, how demoralising and damaging it is to family life? And how does it protect children if the law undermines parental authority? If families are ripped apart by damaging police investigations because a child was smacked? And I think it would discredit the whole concept of domestic abuse as well as child abuse if, under this bill, we were to treat smacking as assault and do ourselves an assault on family coherence. Finally, my lords, for many weeks now, we, following this domestic abuse bill, have focused on the dark side of family life. And earlier this evening, we heard harrowing tales of stalking and abuse and women at risk and so on. However, we must make sure that this doesn't poison our worldview, and we should avoid starting to see abuse everywhere. Behind closed doors is not a dystopian hellhole. The majority of families are joyous places of solidarity and socialising children that are sometimes messy, sometimes argumentative, sometimes a bit of shouting, sometimes the odd smack, but they are largely full of love. This amendment suggests otherwise and should be rejected.
The reasonable chastisement defence helps to ensure that good parents do not find themselves being accused of being a child abuser for doing something perfectly gentle and humane. The reasonable chastisement defence therefore exists firstly to keep children safe and secondly to protect loving, decent parents. The current law does not need amending. It achieves the right balance. Who, after all, wants to criminalise reasonable behaviour? I expect most of us experienced reasonable chastisement when we were children. In a 2017 Comres poll found this was the experience of 85% of adults. If reasonable chastisement was so harmful that it deserved to be criminalised, you'd expect 8 out of 10 adults to manifest the same symptoms as children who have been abused. But of course, they do not. How many of us, those of us as parents, whose parents loved us, cared for us, and taught us right from wrong, think our childhoods would have been better if our parents had been prosecuted merely for giving us a well-deserved smack on the bottom? Because that is what this amendment would mean for families today. Parents have a huge range of tactics and strategies at their disposal to help their children grow up into kind, diligent adults. Gentle instruction, words of praise, the naughty step, withdrawing privileges, but for many parents, reasonable chastisement sometimes fits the bill. Who are we to make criminals of those whose parenting philosophy differs from our own on this point? And for every person who claims such common sense parenting is damaging, we have thousands of sensible parents living in the real world who are convinced otherwise. Opinion poll after opinion poll shows that 3/4 of the public do not want to expose parents who use reasonable chastisement to the full force of the criminal law. This amendment is neither necessary nor wanted by the public. We should not use the criminal law to enforce political fashions and condemn the mums and dads of today for making the same decisions many of us have made. We must let parents decide for themselves. Common sense should not result in a criminal record.
The current legal position is clear, appropriate, and protects children from abuse and harm. The government does not accept that the law as it stands is in breach of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. We believe that it is compliant with Articles 19 and 37 in relation to abuse and violence towards children.